Honourable Chairperson of this august House, Mr. President, Leader of the Opposition, honourable members of this National Assembly, it is actually a privilege to be able to be part of this debate, but I must say that this debate on the state of our nation is at a critical time. Our nation is actually in a disaster. Not only a declaration of disaster, but so many components of our society are absolutely in a state of disaster. I'm only going to focus on two things in this debate. I want to focus on the energy crisis. And I'm going to start off by, Honourable Minister and the Presidency, putting some numbers on the table, some facts. You called for the facts. It has been over 5,500 days since South Africa first experienced rolling blackouts in our country. It has been almost 3,000 days since the then Deputy President, the now President Cyril Ramaphosa, was made responsible for the Eskom war room. Nearly 3,000 days, remember that number. It has been over 200 days since the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, addressed the nation with his crisis interventions after 3 weeks of the worst load shedding and power cuts that we had ever experienced. This was on the 25th of July last year, more than 200 days ago. We have had 167 days of power cuts since September 2022, only 2 days without rolling blackouts across our country. As the Leader of the Opposition says, more than 1,000 hours of load shedding in our country. And our response: we already have 3 ministers who are responsible in one way or another to make sure that we fix this problem. We have now the announcement of a new Minister of Energy. And then we declare a disaster, which brings another minister in play. So now we have 4 ministers responsible for fixing this problem, and we put another minister of disasters on top of those 4 ministers and say, you must now go and fix this problem. I say to this House that this is an imperial presidency. This is political rhetoric. It is about lavish spending, no detail, and contradictory information on sorting out this absolutely disastrous problem that every citizen of our country is facing. Do you know that we cannot get real clarity on real detail of where we are with this disaster? I have attended many meetings, and I will tell you about that clarity, because the same minister says we want the facts. I'll tell you one fact. Since the then President called that disaster committee over 200 days ago, we have not seen 1 more megawatt come into our energy system. Not one. That's a fact. There have actually been less megawatts in our system since that meeting was called on the 25th of July, 2022. And when I say we need clarity, I've actually written to the President, because the clarity is so glaringly missing. If you go to the PCC and you see what is said there, where they say up to 8,822 megawatts will be brought in this year into our energy provision. I'll say that again, 8,822. But when you start interrogating the 2023 8,822 megawatts, the first thing that comes into that mix is 1,621 megawatts from our neighboring countries. Don't we sell power to our neighboring countries? Are we going to send it to them and then get it back? So far, we're hearing that it's not 1,625, but it's maybe 300. Let's talk about the Kusile component of that 8,800 megawatts. That's 2,880 megawatts. The 2,880 megawatts comes from Unit 1, 2, and 3 of Kusile plus Unit 5. Now, if you know anything about Kusile, you'll know Unit 5 is only coming online next year, and when it comes on, it's got to be trialed first. So that's not this year, that's next year. We also know that Unit 1, 2, and 3, and I didn't get this from my letter to the President, I got this from my own meetings, myself going to look for myself, to find out for myself. Those 3 flues, of which the one is totally collapsed, are filled with a build-up inside, one could call it soot, sometimes up to 60 centimeters thick. To solve that problem is at least, from the professionals, 10 months. At least, that takes us to the end of the year. How on earth are we going to get those 3 units back in? So every single detail that's been put on the table is rubbish. How are we supposed to work with that, Mr. President? I also want to say that the urgency that we're hearing now is way too late. Way too late. Can I also say to you that now 5 days after the SONA and declaring a disaster to sort out this emergency of power production in our country, we have not seen the regulations yet. And that is actually where the problems lie. If we don't get the regulations right, the whole thing will fail. But I can also say to you that this province will play its part. We've already started putting forward our comments on the regulations. I also want to say one other thing that was said from this podium today about how we're going to solve this problem, and we spoke about the Eskom debt. Here's a fact, Minister. The fact is, we are going to take that debt and remove it from Eskom, so-called write it off. And what will we do? We'll add that debt back on to the debt carried by the citizens and the taxpayers of this country. So those that are paying their electricity are now going to have to pay the debt of everyone else who hasn't paid their electricity. That is totally unacceptable. That's a fact, Minister. Where is the urgency, I ask, to the government of this country? You know that on the 24th of February last year, almost a year ago, there was some colonization taking place in the Northern Hemisphere. The Russian government invaded the Ukraine nearly a year ago. And what was the consequence of that illegal war? The consequence was an energy crisis in another part of the world, in Europe, because Russia provides gas to much of Europe. Europe knew that there was an energy crisis on the way. So 200 days after the president announced this action plan, not 1 megawatt extra. In Germany, when they knew that 17% of their energy production is going to be at risk because they were not going to get Russian gas, they built a brand new gasification system. That took 192 days, done and dusted, ready to operate. 192 days, less time than it took between the announcement by the president and not 1 megawatt. The Dutch went better than that. They also had the same risk in energy, and they took 160 days to create their own gasification import systems so that they could mitigate their energy risks going into their winter. 160 days. And we are sitting at 200 days and not even 1 megawatt.
As you conclude, Honourable Member.
I now need to conclude, and I haven't even spoken about safety or murder. Do you know, Chair, that wasn't mentioned by the President? The 18.7% increase in murder in the Eastern Cape of 4,407 people last year, the 5,570 people murdered in Gauteng, the 6,495 people murdered in KZN.
Your time is up.
And the 4,109 people murdered in this province. That minister never said a word about it, and neither did that president, and that minister must go. So must this ANC government.